So despite their simple appearance, I'm sure as you all have probably experienced, funding applications can often be confusing and not as straightforward as one likes. On top of that, organizations we usually have to apply to more than one funder in order to ensure stability and diversity in their income. Even though different funding applications will have similarities, they will inevitably vary. And as an organization that is almost entirely funded by multiple grants coming from different partners as well, FEL has significant experience with this daunting task. The following webinar will walk you through the process of how FEL prepares, writes up, and checks its funding applications. It will provide some pre-application advice, as well as some important terms associated with funding applications. Following that, there will be focus on the write-up itself, and the webinar will end with some pre-submission checks and any questions that you might have. Okay. So we'll start up with something quite obvious, but it doesn't hurt to say, first and foremost, check if you're actually eligible for the funding that you're going after. Read all the guidance on the specific funding scheme. You can usually find information about eligibility and suitability, what's on offer, how to apply, and deadlines on the funder's website. Find out more about the grants awarded under the specific scheme that you're interested in. Make sure your project meets the objectives of the funder, as well as the funder meeting your own objectives. It is always worth calling the funder beforehand to talk through your project. This also helps to build a relationship with them, so pretty much two birds with one stone. During your initial conversations with them, make sure to check certain things. For example, check what the fund will not pay for. For example, it might pay for bikes, but not accessories or staff time. An important point for any grant is if you need match funding, or will the funder often fund 100% towards your project. How likely is it that you will meet the match requirements? And be very realistic about this, because it does make it is quite important. Check the payment schedules with the funder and make sure that if payments are in arrears, your organization can afford the capital revenue costs up in front, or be prepared to discuss a payment plan with the funder beforehand. Some funders are also mutually exclusive, which means that you will not be able to combine them. So if you're applying for more than one, keep your eyes open for this and ask the funders for that information. Lastly, this should be obvious, but give yourself plenty of time to write the application itself. It is really important that you avoid rushing the write-up. Allow plenty of time ahead of the deadline, and check the specific funding scheme page for advice about your application, including deadlines and the submissions. Usually those are always in bold, so you can easily find them. After your initial conversations, you will inevitably come face to face with a mountain of funding terminology, and we have compiled the essential ones, starting with match funding itself. Match funding is a requirement in many funding applications and means that the funder agrees to commit a certain amount of resources towards the project, as long as the delivery organization also commits resources to the project. The most commonly known type of match funding in Scotland is 1-to-1 or 50%, which means that for every pound the funder provides, they expect a further £1 to be provided by the applicant. Example funds like this are PATS for All and the Energy Saving Trusts. Most of their schemes are often a 50% one. A key point to know is that the applicant's match funding does not have to come from their own resource or bank account. It can often be supplied via another grant-giving body. There are two distinguishing types of funding, the first one being capital funding. A capital expenditure is for the acquisition of long-term fixed assets such as facilities, equipment, or infrastructure. They are also characterized by their one-off nature, and common examples of capital-funded projects are cycle paths, bike fleets, and cycle parking, among others. The second one is revenue funding. So revenue expenditures are short-term expenses that usually cover ongoing operational and maintenance costs. In contrast to capital, revenue expenses are usually reoccurring and short-term. And examples of them being such as doctor bike, staffing, and consumables during your events. The next important part is in-kind support. When an affiliated organization or the applicant provides a service or a product to the project free of charge, its value can be claimed as a proportion of the match funding. And examples for that can be if you're employing volunteers or you're dedicating your own materials and equipment. All of those can be used as match funding, as part of your match funding. One of the more complicated parts is the VAT inclusion. So any material resource always assumes 20% VAT on top unless otherwise stated. This is particularly important for capital items. Check with the supplier if VAT is included when looking for quotes, as some do not include it in the quote itself. If that is the case, ask them to amend the quote so that it does, because you will need it. If you forget to include this in your application, your organization may have to find the additional money at short notice or from your own bank account, which sometimes can be quite problematic. Many funders will also ask if you're VAT registered, as this allows to reclaim part of the VAT back from the government. If you're not, communicate that with the funder before you spend any significant time on your project, as it might change sometimes. Another thing that often comes up as part of funding is that some funders pay in arrears. That essentially means that the funding will be provided after the project has been completed or at a specific checkpoints during the project itself. Two essential parts of any funding applications are outputs and outcomes. It's easy to distinguish them as in outputs. Funders are usually looking for quantifiable physical evidence of what you're planning to do. Examples can be the number of LED rides you're doing, the number of pop-ups, signage, etc. On the other hand, outcomes are you're expected to explain what your outputs will eventually achieve, what the consequences of your actions will be. Examples can be increase in active travel levels, carbon saved, or even attitude towards a certain mode of travel that has changed after the project. We, having passed this initial stage, the first steps you take towards your grant application, it's a good idea to have a thorough look through the whole application itself in order to get an idea of its expectations. Doing so will also enable you to conduct a preliminary plan of all the content you ideally include. Having done that, break it into sections and come up with several guiding questions for each one, which will help you direct you in the following information hunt. For example, what do you want to achieve and why is it important? Can you evidence a need for your project? What is your ultimate goal? Who will be working with and why? Do you have a timeline? How will you demonstrate your project can be successful? And how will you evaluate the progress? These will also aid you in not getting distracted and avoiding vague, generic, and convoluted statements that can easily disinterest funders. This is crucial, especially when you're restricted by a word count. Another thing to keep in mind is be positive and use words to express that, such as we will do this or we are confident in achieving. Funders want to see that you're confident about the delivery process. Be consistent and concise with your message and outcomes. And last but not least, allowing a proofread can help to expose any weaknesses or oversights that you might have missed. So definitely try to include a bit of time for that. Once you're happy with the structure, it is time to collect all the information necessary. This task is often very time consuming, but it's much better to be overflowing with content than to have a lack of it. Amassing all the required information beforehand and establishing a clear and easy to follow narrative facilitates your planning efforts. Following that plan structure helps to avoid the need to suddenly include a new content fragment halfway through, as doing so can often feel as if you're forcing a puzzle piece where it's not meant to be. It is also useful to underline statistics, facts, and quotations and their source that might be useful to include in your application. Often, if you want to get an idea of the information you will need to provide in your application, you can have a look at the projects that the funder has backed before. As most funders will provide or release an annual booklet of the initiatives they have supported, which can be accessed via their website or available as a physical copy. Lastly, consider writing the initial text in a Word document or a similar program first, so you can read and edit your responses more easily. Word count can also be checked easier that way. When happy, copy and paste into the submission form itself. This is particularly relevant if the form is online. So after you've passed the initial preparation stage, we come to the point where you're actually writing up the application. You should assume that the reader knows absolutely nothing of your organization and the project that you're introducing. It is often easy to skim over important details that are clear to you personally, but might appear underdeveloped to a different person. A useful tool here is to create a timeline which will underline what and when is needed to take your project to completion. Remember to keep referring to facts and evidence throughout the application, which details what the need is for your project and how will you achieve your ultimate goal. This can be done by setting and referencing short, medium, and long-term objectives according to your specific project. Definitely spend some time to break down your budget as much as possible in order to create a clear cost analysis that accurately represents the value of planning, research, project delivery, and evaluation. If it is a capital project, think about what is needed to support it, not just the items themselves. How much would your staff and office cost be? What about VAT, in-kind support, and travel, if those are applicable? It is easy. Well, last but not least, it is easy to disregard evaluation, but it is important that you carefully create a robust way to measure your impact. If you don't plan how will you evaluate your projects before beginning, it will be impossible to collect the correct data you need after the whole thing is done. Depending on the nature of your projects, different evaluation methods will be more or less suitable. Evaluation Support Scotland has a series of online workshops that provide exactly this kind of help for third sector organizations. That's them in the presentations, but you can just Google them and you'll find the relevant information. The collected data will be required when reporting back to your funder and is highly valuable when applying for future funding. Case studies of your projects can reassure the funder and improve your credibility and reliability. Once you've done the mass of the work, there's a few things that you should focus on doing pre-submission. Have your application read over by a colleague. It is always helpful to have someone look over your work while you're putting it together. Ask a colleague to take some time to read your work. This will help you identify gaps, any potential flaws and inaccuracies in your work. Something that seems obvious to you might not be clearly written or explained for someone new to your project. Doing a final check on your document is also quite important. Check your spelling and grammar, of course. Autocorrect is useful and handy, but can often lead to unintended errors, which is why reading through it yourself and ideally someone else holds a great merit. I'll give you one personal example. In a previous webinar I was writing up, unknown to me, Word kept correcting panniers, which was aiming for, to poniards. So one being a bike accessory that we use very often in FEL, the other one being a medieval dagger. Last but not least, be open to constructive criticism and feedback, and definitely consider refining certain parts of the document as per suggestions. A few final takeaways and know-hows about the topic. First of all, once again, check eligibility before doing anything else. It can save you a lot of time. Explore what does the fund cover and its match funding specifics. Give yourself plenty of time, and I can't stress that enough. Before starting to write, make a plan structure aided by key questions. Create a realistic timeline with key points in your project's lifecycle. Create a detailed breakdown of your budget. Spend some time thinking about how you will collect the data from your project and evaluate it. And finally, proofread the text yourself and ideally ask a colleague to do it as well. Yeah, which brings us to the end of the webinar today. So if you have any questions, yeah, please go for it. You can also send questions later on via my email, which is on the slide as well. So if you want to think it over and just send questions later on, that's perfectly fine as well. I'm more than happy to answer them.
I do have a question. I'm just going to quickly finish writing something down and then I'll ask it. But I just didn't want you to jump off the call. Okay. Thanks very much, Georgie. That was really useful and interesting and good just to, there's a lot that goes into them, isn't there? Into funding applications. There's lots to think through. So it's always good just to kind of lay them out. One question I do have is, where would you usually put sort of training courses in terms of capital or revenue funding?
Right. So it really depends on the funding from the funder itself. I would say that training, it usually will go in revenue, but it does not. The best way to do it is just to ask the funder themselves. Either give them a call or send them an email. Ask them, where should I put this? They'll give you the answer, because it's just, they vary. So
yeah. Okay.